This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Differentiating between conditions and care really changed my approach to plant care. Hi everybody and welcome back to our YouTube channel. We've all seen this advice online where people say water once a week, water every 5 days, fertilize once a month, repot every 6 months and so on. And I always think it's a bit cringy when I hear these really precise, exact care tips. And hopefully by the end of this video you will understand why I think it's cringy and why I think it's actually the wrong advice to give. On this channel, I'm a firm believer in providing you with principles or guidelines rather than giving you it step by step. This is not a recipe that we need to follow. And again, hopefully by the end of this video, it will become clear as to why. I have previously touched on the concept of differentiating between conditions and care, but it's almost a year ago. And I think this concept deserves its own video because when that concept kind of clicked in my head, it all made sense and it really shaped the way that I look after my plants or the way that I choose my plants in the first place. This whole concept of differentiating between conditions and care really clicked in my head when I read this quote by Daryl Cheng, aka Houseplant Journal. He said, "Light dictates the growth potential of your plant. Care realizes that potential." And I would like to actually expand on this. I would say that the conditions set the potential of the plant and then the care realizes the potential. So, let's drill into this concept a little bit deeper. Conditions are things such as light exposure, temperature, humidity, airflow. So it's basically the environment that the plant grows in. Care are things like watering frequency, fertilizer and fertilizing frequency, pest treatment, the medium that you use to grow it in, the pot that you grow it in or the size of the pot, the repotting frequency and so on. So it's all of the things that you do to the plant. That was really high level. Let's go into a little bit more detail. But before we keep going with the video, let's hear a word about today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creators with a depth of topics ranging from illustration, graphic design, photography to music, marketing and productivity. If you're new to a skill or already a pro, Skillshare has classes to offer that suit your needs and experience. This week I took a class by Mike Hardy called Productivity Habits That Stick using time theming. When I hear the word productivity, I always think about just working hard, getting as many things done as possible. But I really like the way that Mike explained this concept.
I'm passionate about productivity because I really want to help people get more of the right things done. And that's the key, the right things done. We spend a lot of time doing busy work and just checking off as many boxes as possible. My goal is to help people check off the right boxes.
Productivity isn't just working hard, it's working with intention and attention. Something else Mike spoke about is called habit stacking. So basically you're using an existing habit and you're stacking another habit that you want to create on the back of it. Really easy example would be every time you brush your teeth, you floss after. But you can apply that to anything else in your life. For example, plant care. Every time I top up my water bottles to go ahead and start watering my plants, I also add fertilizer to it. It's just become a habit. And eventually, if you keep stacking more and more habits onto each other, it's starting to become a routine. And routines are usually a really productive way to get all of the important things done that you have to do without really having to think about it. The first 1,000 people to use the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Thank you Skillshare for sponsoring this video, but let's get back into it. Alright, let's talk about conditions first. So the conditions that a plant needs to thrive is really predetermined by the plant. And now, of course, plants can survive in a variety of different conditions and they're tolerant to fluctuations in the environment. But for the sake of today's video, I'm really trying to talk about getting the most out of your plants, not just have them survive. We want them to thrive. We want them to grow large to their full potential. So for them to thrive, they need to grow in conditions that is similar to its native environment. So for example, these plants around me, or most of the plants that I grow, are tropical plants. So these plants prefer warmer temperatures, higher humidity, consistent airflow, and so on. They will not tolerate conditions like frost, for example. So ultimately, we're at the mercy of the plant. Of course, plants can adjust to the environment, specifically if they're growing up in this environment, specifically if they might have been tissue cultured specifically for indoor growing purposes. These plants might be a little more removed to its to their natural environment than a plant that you would take from the forest would be, right? Like these plants have grown up in indoor environments, so they're more tolerant to it. But most of them actually grew up in very tropical greenhouses. So the concept of conditions still applies. Now, out of those conditions that I mentioned before, light, temperature, humidity, and airflow, light is really the most important. If your plant is not provided with sufficient light, the plant will never grow. It doesn't matter what you do for care. You can do the best care ever. You can give it the best moss pole, have the best potting mix, give it the best fertilizer. If your plant is not getting sufficient light, that's it. Light really does set the potential. But it goes for temperatures and humidity and so on as well. If you have a plant like, let's say, a Queen Anthurium that likes a high humidity environment and you're growing it in a really dry environment on top of a heater with maybe 20% humidity, that plant will never thrive. Same goes for temperatures. If you have a plant that prefers hotter temperatures and you're growing it outside and it's freezing cold, this plant will not thrive. It probably won't even survive. So first and foremost, we need to make sure that we provide our plants with the conditions that they prefer. Of course, all of these plants in nature would probably have individual preferences, but they obviously all grow in the same environment. So there is there's a spectrum, right? There's like a width of conditions that the plant can survive and thrive in. It's not necessarily like, oh, it must be exactly 25 degrees. I'm more referring to like a spectrum, right? Like, okay, these plants will be thriving as long as I grow them anywhere between, let's say, 18 degrees and 30. If I grow them in 5 degrees, they're probably not gonna survive, or definitely not gonna thrive. If I grow them in temperatures of like 40 plus, they're just gonna burn to a crisp. So there's some sort of width or like a spectrum of humidity, a spectrum of temperature, a spectrum of light exposure that the plant really prefers to thrive in. And as I mentioned again, this is not for us to decide. It doesn't matter how much you want this plant to grow. If you don't provide it with the environmental conditions that it prefers, it will just not happen. Or there's very little you can do with your care approach to overcome poor conditions. However, we're not completely at the mercy of the plants. There's two things that we can do. First of all, we could assess our environment and then choose plants that suit the environment. Or we could choose the plants, understand what environment these plants would prefer, and then supplement our conditions accordingly. So that's where things like grow lights come in, or humidifiers, fans for airflow, heaters for temperature, and so on. Obviously, that's a little more involved. If you want to supplement the conditions, that kind of brings the plant hobby to like the next level. It is no longer set and forget. It is now actually having to care for your plants as well as caring for the conditions. So making sure that you supplement the environment to always provide the plant with the conditions that they like. So a little bit more work, but a lot of people are happy to do that. And a great way of doing that is, for example, setting up a little greenhouse, like an IKEA cabinet or a tent. I mean, they look hideous, but some people have the desire to put a tent in their living room, and so be it. It's a great way to provide these plants with great conditions. So let's have a look at this. I've got two humidity readers in my living room. I have one in my IKEA cabinet and I have one just out and about. So let's have a look at the reading. So it's just loading, and I'll pop in some screenshots on the side for you. While it's loading, I'm going to just cuddle my little baby. Why are you turning away from the camera, huh? Okay, so over the last week inside the cabinet, the average temperature is about 20.9 degrees Celsius, and it fluctuates between 23.7 and 17.9. So it's just over 5 degrees in difference. Now, when it comes to humidity, the average is 98.3%, and it fluctuates between 99.9 and 52.4. Now that 52.4, and you'll see that on the screenshot that I'll post, is when I was cleaning the cabinet and I left the door open for like half an hour or so. The temperature, the humidity obviously dropped really quickly, but overall you can see that the temperature, the humidity is very, very consistent at around 98%, which is obviously amazing for these tropical plants. Need to make sure with humidity like that there's always airflow. So there's a fan that is on 24/7 inside my cabinet. So let's compare that to my living room. Loading, loading, loading. Why are you so cute, my baby? Alright, so let's have a look. Temperature averages around 19.4 degrees and it fluctuates between 22.2 and 17.6. So not all too much different when it comes to the temperature, which is also to be expected. I don't have a heater in my IKEA cabinet. There's just a grow light that would keep it a little bit warmer potentially. But I also have a heater in the living room itself. Plus it gets quite a lot of nice sun exposure, so it heats up naturally quite well. When it comes to the humidity, the max would be at around 80.5%, and there was definitely the other day when it was just raining non-stop and I had all my windows open, but it goes down to 35%, and you can see that there's heaps more fluctuations just kind of every day and night. Like every day there's a bit of fluctuation over there. Now the average is still almost 70% humidity, which is actually, I'm really surprised by that. I didn't expect it to be that humid because it was actually quite dry recently. Alrighty, that difference wasn't huge, but I suppose it's because Sydney naturally has quite decent conditions in the first place. But you could imagine if you live somewhere that is much drier or somewhere that is much colder, having like an enclosed environment like the IKEA cabinet would be great for you to supplement the conditions in just a smaller space, which just makes it much easier for you and also more livable, right? And I personally don't use any humidifiers. I just let the moss poles and the water that evaporates from the plants in the moss poles kind of boost my humidity naturally. But again, in Sydney over here, we're pretty blessed with naturally decent conditions. Right, so that's option number one. You create the conditions that the plants that you need to thrive in. The other option is assessing your conditions and then opting for plants that suit your conditions in the first place. Good example would be office buildings. Office buildings always have a lot of air conditioning, which means that the air is always dry. It is usually not super light filled, right? Like a lot of office buildings are more on the dark side. So, and the temperature, I suppose, is usually kept fairly low if you compare it to like a tropical greenhouse because people need to work in it, right? So the plants that you see grow in offices often is pothos or snake plants. So plants that are very tolerant to a variety of conditions and much drier environments compared to some of these other tropical plants. Like you wouldn't put a Queen Anthurium in an office building and just have air conditioning blast on it all day long. It wouldn't make any sense. So in these office buildings, they choose plants that suit the conditions rather than supplementing the conditions to suit the plants that they want. So that's something that you can do as well. And the best way to go about it is, well, understanding what is local to you, what's native to your environment, or what can grow in your environment. So I get heavily inspired just by what I find on the street, what I find in the botanic garden, and so on. Now actually on that note, getting a little sidetracked, but obviously the conditions that you have outside are important, and that will probably dictate the conditions that you've got inside as well to a big extent. But in Australia it's kind of weird. In winter it is actually colder indoors than it is outdoors. Unless of course you put in the effort and money to heat your house. But a lot of places, specifically if you can't heat all of the rooms in your apartment, it's actually colder inside than it is outside. So a lot of people are more challenged growing plants indoors than they are growing them outdoors. At least that's over here in Sydney. I'm not too sure what it's like in other states, but just a little fun fact. Alrighty, so that kind of wraps up the conditions part, but of course we're going to have to come back to conditions when we're talking about the care approach. But basically, in a nutshell, when it comes to conditions, it is not up to you to choose the conditions that the plant needs to thrive in. If you want to get the best out of the plant, you should grow the plant in conditions that are as close as possible to their native environment so that the plant can really thrive. So for me, those are philodendron and monsteras. They seem to be having a really good time growing in my indoor environment. And that is also just something I found out over time. Not all plants that I grew over the last 4 years are still alive. I definitely killed a few of them, and some of them are also just not thriving, and that is totally fine. If I know that a plant isn't thriving for me, I don't necessarily blame me for that and feel like, oh, I'm a bad plant parent, like, oh, I can't look after plants and so on. It very often is not your fault. It very often is actually impossible to grow this plant, or at least to grow it to its full potential, just purely based on the environment that you've got. So if you live in Canada, for example, you cannot compare your progress to progress that I might receive over here in Australia, because my conditions are naturally so much better for these plants. In return, you probably have some plants that I wouldn't be able to grow over here because our conditions wouldn't suit them. So plants that are more native to Canada might have a really hard time settling in over here, and vice versa, right? Like a desert plant, like a cactus, is going to have a hard time in a very tropical environment because it's going to be too humid. And in return, a tropical rainforest plant is going to just turn into a crisp in the desert. So I get it, Instagram wants us to have like these plants, and we're creating this wish list of plants based on what we've seen growing online and what other people have. But I think the moment you start, the moment you stop worrying about what other people grow on Instagram and you look at what plants suit your conditions and suit your environment and what are even available in your country, the more you'll start enjoying this hobby, because you're not constantly trying to fight nature. But again, each to their own. I reckon just if you're a beginner and you're new to it, do yourself a favor and start with some plants that at least suit the conditions that you're growing in. And once you can look after those, then you can start getting into a few trickier plants that might require a little bit more supplementing. Alrighty, now let's get into care, because when it comes to care, that's where we have flexibility, and that's exactly why I think it is so weird when people are super precise and definitive with their care tips. Right? Care is everything that we do to the plants. In nature, there is no care, right? Mother Nature takes care of it. Mother Nature rains, and there's wind, and there's the sun for temperature, and so on. So in nature, there is no care approach. So when I talk about care, I talk about all of the things that we do to the plant. So giving it a pot, giving it a potting medium, giving it a stake. What sort of support stake are you giving it? Is it a moss pole? Is it not? The watering. How often do we water? When do we water? Do we fertilize? What do we fertilize with? How often do we fertilize? Pest treatment, cleaning the leaves, and so on. That is care. And there is no right or wrong. There's really a couple of things that you need to consider with your care approach. Specifically, kind of 3 things that I want you to consider when it comes to your care. First of all, understand the conditions, right? The conditions set the potential for the plant, but the conditions also kind of set what you need to do as part of your care approach. Secondly, of course, well, the plant in itself. And then thirdly, you as the plant parent, what's your preference? Let's say, for example, I'm growing a Monstera deliciosa, very common plant. Pretty much everybody can get their hands on one of those. The conditions that the plant would prefer to really thrive and mature in are more leaning towards the tropical side, but it is definitely able to survive in a wide variety of conditions. So it's a great example because probably everybody could get their hands on it. Now, when it comes to the care, you need to consider the environment that you're growing it in. If you're growing it in a really high humidity environment, you might need to water less. If you're growing it in a really dry environment, you might need to water it more. If you're growing it in a really hot environment, you might need to water more. If you're growing it in a cold environment, you might need to water less. If the plant is exposed to a lot of light, it's going to grow a lot, which means it's going to need more water. So again, you're watering more. If it's exposed to less light, it's not going to grow as fast, so it's going to need less water. So you see how all of these environmental factors really determine your watering frequency. So if I tell you water your plant every 7 days, but you're growing your plant in an environment that has half the temperature, half the humidity, it's winter, the plant isn't even growing, it's in a ginormous pot with a really water-retaining mix, and I tell you to water it every 7 days, you're probably gonna cause issues because you're not giving your plant enough time to even use the water. So I always challenge you to assess your watering needs based on the conditions that the plant is growing in, based on the plant itself, how big is it, how big is the root system, and so on, and then obviously also what other care factors you have put in place, like what's the mix, what's the size of the pot, and so on. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about potting mix, because I get asked about my aeroid mix a lot. And yes, I have a specific aeroid mix. I mean, it changes all the time, but I use this aeroid mix because it suits my plants in my conditions with my willingness to put effort in. I rather use a very chunky aerated mix that dries out much quicker, which requires me to water more frequently. But I'm willing to put in that effort because it just suits my care approach better. It suits the way that I grow my plants on moss poles better. With the aerated mix, I have very little risk of root rot down in the pot, even if I constantly keep the moss pole moist. If you don't have as much time and you don't want to water your plants quite frequently, you could use a mix that has more water retention. You could use a bigger pot, so there's more potting mix, more volume that can retain water, but you then need to be really conservative with your watering and so on. Obviously still all overlaid with, like, how hot is the environment that the plant grows in, how humid is it, and so on. I mean, we all know this, like, here are my 5 tips for winter, water your plants less often, and so on. Well, it just keeps coming down to conditions. In winter, it is colder. The plants aren't growing because there's less light, so they just have less watering requirement, but still overlay that with what's the potting mix, how big is the plant, and so on. I just don't know how we could all possibly come up with one watering frequency if we are all spread across the world growing our Monstera deliciosas in a variety of different pots. Some grow them in leca, some grow them in just water, some grow them in a really chunky aeroid mix, some grow them in just cocoa peat. Like, how could we all possibly follow the same watering schedule? While it's winter where you are and it's maybe scorching hot where I am. That's impossible. So always think about these things. Don't just follow a step-by-step guide. Let's use another example, fertilizer. I use a liquid plant nutrient, GT Foliage Focus. I talk about it pretty much all the time, and more information is in the description, including a discount code if you want to order it. Now, it is a plant mineral that has the 12 essential nutrients that plants require, readily available, kind of mixed together, so when I water it, the plant can absorb these nutrients straight away. The recommendation, I didn't make this up, I'm just using it as per recommendation. It is recommended that you use it in a weak to medium dilution on a regular basis. So I use a weak dilution every week. So I consistently provide my plants with the nutrients that it needs to thrive in. You can't just take any fertilizer or any nutrient and do that, right? Some nutrients or some fertilizers, for example, actually rely on bacteria in your mix to break down these compounds into the 12 minerals that can then be absorbed by your plants. So you need to consider that. It's not every fertilizer is as readily available to be absorbed by the plant as the GT Foliage Focus, for example, is. That doesn't mean that there's only one way or the other. For example, Jake PlantGuy, shout out Jake if you're watching, he uses slow release fertilizer pellets and it's working for him. He doesn't fertilize with every watering weekly, right? And his plants are still thriving. So there's no one right approach when it comes to plant care. As long as you get the principle right, you're providing your plants with the nutrients that it needs. It doesn't matter in what way you provide it to the plant, as long as the plant will eventually be able to absorb it, right? Of Of course, some products might be superior to others, but I haven't tested all of them in the world. I haven't done that experiment, so I can't talk about it. I can only talk from my experience. And yeah, GT Foliage Focus is great, but is there other products that could achieve the same? Totally. You just need to use the product in line with the way that it was designed to be used, right? So when it comes to the care, we have flexibility. If fertilizing on a weekly basis is too much effort for you, choose a fertilizer that you don't have to provide on a weekly basis. Maybe a slow release fertilizer where it automatically releases nutrients on a weekly basis based on watering or based on temperatures and so on. And last example of how flexible care can be is, let's talk about repotting or potting size overall, because it's a comment I get a lot. A lot of people are really shocked by the small pot sizes that I've got. But the reason why I get away with the small pots is because of all the other things that I do in my care. I have a moss pole that is a vertical extension of the pot. I water quite frequently, so a small pot obviously dries out quicker, specifically if it's fairly root bound, but it works with my high watering frequency. And thirdly, I provide liquid nutrients that are readily available with every watering, so even if the plant is root bound, it is not relying on the nutrients within the pot, it's relying on the nutrients that I feed it on a weekly basis in the first place. So it is totally fine for me to get away with these small pots because I'm still hitting all the requirements that the plant needs. And first and foremost, the plants are grown in an environment that suits the plant. So the plant is going to thrive almost like no matter what. It's almost real. If you grow your plant in conditions that are really good for the plant, it's almost harder to kill your plant than to keep it alive. The plant's entire purpose in life is to survive. The plant wants to survive. It has this built-in desire to survive and procreate. So if you give it the conditions, you have flexibility with care. So we don't need to fight over one care approach being better than the other, one moss pole being better than the other, one substrate being better than the other. We have flexibility. We can all kind of choose what works for the plants that we've got, the conditions that we've got, and what works for us, right? Sorry, I kind of got distracted there. We were talking about potting size, yes. So there is no rule being like, oh, if your plant has 5 leaves, you need to put it in a bigger pot. Or every time you pot it up, size up the pot by 2 centimeters. I did a video most recently where I actually told you that pretty much 90 to 95% of my plants fit in one of 3 pot sizes. I go from 10 to 14 to 20 centimeters, and that's it. I don't have any like mini steps in between. They just go from 14 straight to 20 and they're just fine. But they're just fine because I use a chunky and aerated mix. I am more conservative with watering if it's colder and so on. I always overlay my care approach with the conditions that I'm currently, or like that the plants are currently facing. That's why they're okay. You can't necessarily take that same approach, take a tiny plant, size it up in a significantly large pot, use a mix that is way too water retaining, put it in a really cold corner and water it every day. Of course it's gonna die. I'm getting really passionate about this topic, as you can tell, so it's probably time for me to wrap it up. But I hope you can tell that everything that I discussed at this stage is not very definitive. I did not give you a definitive guide on how to look after your plants, because there isn't. If I made one thing clear, then hopefully it is that, well, it isn't black and white. It isn't easy necessarily. And yeah, this is different for all of us. Every single person has a different environment, different conditions, and probably different preferences. So you can take inspiration from maybe me and my plant journey. You can maybe take some tips and tricks from me, but I will never be able to save you from having to overlay it with your own thought process and understand your own conditions and apply that accordingly. I will not be able to do that for you. You need to do that for yourself. But that is the best way for you to become better at growing plants. It is, after all, a skill that you need to acquire and learn over time. It's nothing that you're just born with. Looking after plants or having a green thumb is really just having had the experience, being good at assessing your conditions and being good to take actions accordingly. And that just comes over time, and that comes with trial and error. And if things don't go wrong, then honestly, I don't know what you're doing, but it's normal for things to go wrong. I've had heaps of plants die on me, but I've learned something from every single plant and was able to incorporate that into my plant journey and become better at growing my plants. I hope this made sense, all of this. I really hope so. It's a very abstract concept, and I know a lot of people jump on YouTube because they want to be given that 10-step recipe. They're just like, no, I don't want to think for myself. I want you to tell me exactly how many times I need to water my Monstera, but this is advice that you will probably never get from me because I just disagree with it. It is not in line with what I think plant care should be all about. So, sorry about that. If that's what you came here for and that's not what you got, then it is what it is. But I hope that the majority of you really understood this concept, and I hope it really changes the way that you look at your plant care or your plant journey going forward. And I hope it makes you go easy on yourself. If some plants are not thriving or not surviving, then it might have nothing to do with you. It might have everything to do with the conditions, and it was just not meant to be. Alrighty, that's it for me. Thank you so much for watching. Like, subscribe, and leave a nice comment, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!